faith in the future of society and in the future of history. The widening horizon. The conception which I have put forward in these lectures of history is a constantly moving process, with the historian moving within it, seems to commit me to some concluding reflections on the position of history and of the historian in our time. We live in an epoch when, not for the first time in history, predictions of world catastrophe are in the air, and weigh heavily on all. They can be neither proved nor disproved. But they are at any rate far less certain than the prediction that we shall all die, and, since the certainty of that prediction does not prevent us from laying plans for our own future, so I shall proceed to discuss the present and future of our society on the assumption that this country, or, if not this country, some major part of the world, will survive the hazards that threaten us, and that history will continue. The middle years of the 20th century find the world in a process of change probably more profound and more sweeping than any which has overtaken it since the medieval world broke up in ruins and the foundations of the modern world were laid in the 15th and 16th centuries. The change is no doubt ultimately the product of scientific discoveries and inventions, of their ever more widespread application, and of developments arising directly or indirectly out of them. The most conspicuous aspect of the change is a social revolution comparable with that which, in the 15th and 16th centuries, inaugurated the rise to power of a new class based on finance and commerce, and later on industry. The new structure of our industry and the new structure of our society present problems too vast for me to embark on here. But the change has two aspects more immediately relevant to my theme, what I may call a change in depth, and a change in geographical extent. I will attempt to touch briefly on both of these. History begins when men begin to think of the passage of time in terms not of natural processes, the cycle of the seasons, the human lifespan, but of a series of specific events in which men are consciously involved and which they can consciously influence. History, says Burckhardt, is the break with nature caused by the awakening of consciousness. 1 History is the long struggle of man, by the exercise of his reason, to understand his environment and to act upon it. But the modern period has broadened the struggle in a revolutionary way. Man now seeks to understand, and to act on, not only his environment, but himself, and this has added, so to speak, a new dimension to reason, and a new dimension to history. The present age is the most historically minded of all ages. Modern man is to an unprecedented degree self-conscious and therefore conscious of history. He peers eagerly back into the twilight out of which he has come in the hope that its faint beams will illuminate the obscurity into which he is going, and, conversely, his aspirations and anxieties about the path that lies ahead quicken his insight into what lies behind. Past, present and future are linked together in the endless chain of history. The change in the modern world which consisted in the development of man's consciousness of himself may be said to begin with Descartes, who first established man's position as a being who can not only think, but think about his own thinking, who can observe himself in the act of observing, so that man is simultaneously the subject and the object of thought and observation. But the development did not become fully explicit till the latter part of the 18th century, when Rousseau opened up new depths of human self-understanding and self-consciousness, and gave man a new outlook on the world of nature and on traditional civilization. The French Revolution, said Tocqueville, was inspired by the belief that what was wanted was to replace the complex of traditional customs governing the social order of the day by simple, elementary rules deriving from the exercise of the human reason and from natural law. Point 2, never till then, wrote Acton in one of his manuscript notes, had men sought liberty, knowing what they sought. 3 For Acton, as for Hegel, liberty and reason were never far apart. And with the French Revolution was linked the American Revolution. 7 years ago our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It was, as Lincoln's words suggest, a unique event, the first occasion in history when men deliberately and consciously formed themselves into a nation, and then consciously and deliberately set out to mold other men into it. In the 17th and 18th centuries man had already become fully conscious of the world around him and of its laws. They were no longer the mysterious the world around him and of its laws. They were no longer the mysterious decrees of an inscrutable providence, but laws accessible to reason. But they were laws to which man was subject, and not laws of his own making. In the next stage, man was to become fully conscious of his power over his environment and over himself, and of his right to make the laws under which he would live. The transition from the 18th century to the modern world was long and gradual. Its representative philosophers were Hegel and Marx, both of whom occupy an ambivalent position. Hegel is rooted in the idea of laws of providence converted into laws of reason. Hegel's world spirit grasps providence firmly with one hand and reason with the other. He echoes Adam Smith. Individuals gratify their own interests, but something more is thereby accomplished which is latent in their action though not present in their consciousness. Of the rational purpose of the world spirit he writes that men, in the very act of realizing it, make it the occasion of satisfying their desire, whose import is different from that purpose. This is simply the harmony of interests translated into the language of German philosophy. Point 4. Hegel's equivalent for Smith's hidden hand was the famous cunning of reason, which sets men to work to fulfill purposes of which they are not conscious. But Hegel was nonetheless the philosopher of the French Revolution, the first philosopher to see the essence of reality in historical change and in the development of man's consciousness of himself. Development in history meant development towards the concept of freedom. But, after 1815, the inspiration of the French Revolution fizzled out in the doldrums of the Restoration. Hegel was politically too timid and, in his later years, too firmly entrenched in the establishment of his day to introduce any concrete meaning into his metaphysical propositions. Herzen's description of Hegel's doctrines is, the algebra of revolution, was singularly apartment. Hegel provided the notation, but gave it no practical content. It was left for Marx to write the arithmetic into Hegel's algebraical equations. A disciple both of Adam Smith and of Hegel, Marx started from the conception of a world ordered by rational laws of nature. Like Hegel, but this time in a practical and concrete form, he made the transition to the conception of a world ordered by laws evolving through a rational process in response to man's revolutionary initiative. In Marx's final synthesis, history meant three things, which were inseparable one from another and formed a coherent and rational whole: the motion of events in accordance with objective, and primarily economic, laws, the corresponding development of thought through a dialectical process, and corresponding action in the form of the class struggle which reconciles and unites the theory and practice of revolution. What Marx offers is a synthesis of objective laws and of conscious action to translate them into practice, of what are sometimes, though misleadingly, called determinism and voluntarism. Marx constantly writes of laws to which men have hitherto been subject without being conscious of them. He more than once drew attention to what he called the false consciousness of those enmeshed in a capitalist economy and capitalist society, the conceptions formed about the laws of production in the minds of the agents of production and circulation will differ widely from the real laws. Point 5. But one finds in Marx's writings striking examples of calls for conscious revolutionary action. Philosophers have only interpreted the world differently, ran the famous thesis on Feuerbach, but the point is to change it. The proletariat, declared the Communist Manifesto, will use its political dominance to strip the bourgeoisie step by step of all capital, and concentrate all means of production in the hands of the state. And in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx spoke of intellectual self-consciousness dissolving by a century-old process all traditional ideas. It was the proletariat which would dissolve the false consciousness of capitalist society, and introduce the true consciousness of the classless society. But the failure of the revolutions of 1848 was a serious and dramatic setback to developments which had seemed imminent when Marx began to work. The latter part of the 19th century passed in an atmosphere which was still predominantly one of prosperity and security. It was not till the turn of the century that we complete the transition to the contemporary period of history, in which the primary function of reason is no longer to understand objective laws governing the behavior of man in society, but rather to reshape society and the individuals who compose it by conscious action. In Marx, class, though not precisely defined, remains on the whole an objective conception to be established by economic analysis. In Lenin, the emphasis shifts from class to party, which constitutes the vanguard of the class and infuses into it the necessary element of class consciousness. In Marx, ideology is a negative term, a product of the false consciousness of the capitalist order of society. In Lenin, ideology becomes neutral or positive, a belief implanted by an elite of class-conscious leaders in a mass of potentially class-conscious workers. The molding of class consciousness is no longer an automatic process, but a job to be undertaken. The other great thinker who has added a fresh dimension to reason in our time is Freud. Freud remains today a somewhat enigmatic figure. He was by training and background a 19th-century liberal individualist, and accepted without question the common, but misleading, assumption of a fundamental antithesis between the individual and society. Freud, approaching man as a biological rather than as a social entity, tended to treat the social environment as something historically given rather than as something in constant process of creation and transformation by man himself. He has always been attacked by the Marxists for approaching what are really social problems from the standpoint of the individual, and condemned as a reactionary on that account, and this charge, which was valid only in part against Freud himself, has been much more fully justified by the current neo-Freudian school in the United States, which assumes that maladjustments are inherent in the individual and not in the structure of society, and treats the adaptation of the individual to society as the essential function of psychology. The other popular charge against Freud, that he has extended the role of the irrational in human affairs, is totally false, and rests on a crude confusion between recognition of the irrational element in human behavior and a cult of the irrational. That a cult of the irrational does exist in the English-speaking world today, mainly in the form of a depreciation of the achievements and potentialities of reason, is unfortunately true. It is part of the current wave of pessimism and ultra-conservatism, of which I will speak later. But this does not stem from Freud, who was an unqualified and rather primitive rationalist. What Freud did was to extend the range of our knowledge and understanding by opening up the unconscious roots of human behavior to consciousness and to rational enquiry. This was an extension of the domain of reason, an increase in man's power to understand and control himself, and therefore his environment, and it represents a revolutionary and progressive achievement. In this respect, Freud complements, and does not contradict, the work of Marx. Freud belongs to the contemporary world in the sense that, though he himself did not entirely escape from the conception of a fixed and invariable human nature, he provided tools for a deeper understanding of the roots of human behavior and thus for its conscious modification through rational processes. For the historian, Freud's special significance is twofold. In the first place, Freud has driven the last nail into the coffin of the ancient illusion that the motives from which men allege or believe themselves to have acted are in fact adequate to explain their action. This is a negative achievement of some importance, though the positive claim of some enthusiasts to throw light on the behavior of the great men of history by the methods of psychoanalysis should be taken with a pinch of salt. The procedure of psychoanalysis rests on the cross-examination of the patient who is being investigated. You cannot cross-examine the dead. Secondly, Freud, reinforcing the work of Marx, has encouraged the historian to examine himself and his own position in history, the motives, perhaps hidden motives, which have guided his choice of theme or period and his selection and interpretation of the facts, the national and social background which has determined his angle of vision, the conception of the future which shapes his conception of the past. Since Marx and Freud wrote, the historian has no excuse to think of himself as a detached individual standing outside society and outside history. This is the age of self-consciousness. The historian can and should know what he is doing. This transition to what I have called the contemporary world, the extension to new spheres of the function and power of reason, is not yet complete. It is part of the revolutionary change through which the 20th century world is passing. I should like to examine some of the main symptoms of the transition. Let me begin with economics. Down to 1914, belief in objective economic laws, which governed the economic behavior of men and nations, and which they could defy only to their own detriment, was still virtually unchallenged. Trade cycles, price fluctuations, unemployment, were determined by those laws. As late as 1930, when the Great Depression set in, this was still the dominant view. Thereafter things moved fast. In the 1930s, people began to talk of the end of economic man, meaning the man who consistently pursued his economic interests in accordance with economic laws, and since then nobody, except a few Rip Van Winkles of the 19th century, believes in economic laws in this sense. Today economics has become either a series of theoretical mathematical equations, or a practical study of how some people push others around. The change is mainly a product of the transition from individual to large-scale capitalism. So long as the individual entrepreneur and merchant predominated, nobody seemed in control of the economy or capable of influencing it in any significant way, and the illusion of impersonal laws and processes was preserved. Even the Bank of England, in the days of its greatest power, was thought of not as a skillful operator and manipulator, but as an objective and quasi-automatic registrar of economic trends. But with the transition from a laissez-faire economy to a managed economy, whether a managed capitalist economy or a socialist economy, whether the management is done by large-scale capitalist, and nominally private, concerns or by the state, this illusion is dissolved. It becomes clear that certain people are taking certain decisions for certain ends, and that these decisions set our economic course for us. Everyone knows today that the price of oil or soap does not vary in response to some objective law of supply and demand. Everyone knows, or thinks he knows, that slumps and unemployment are man-made. Governments admit, indeed claim, that they know how to cure them. The transition has been made from laissez-faire to planning, from the unconscious to the self-conscious, from belief in objective economic laws to belief that man by his own action can be the master of his economic destiny. Social policy has gone hand in hand with economic policy. Indeed, economic policy has been incorporated in social policy. Let me quote from the last volume of the first Cambridge Modern History, published in 1910, a highly perceptive comment from a writer who was anything but a Marxist and had probably never heard of Lenin. The belief in the possibility of social reform by conscious effort is the dominant current of the European mind. It has superseded the belief in liberty as the one panacea. Its currency in the present is as significant and as pregnant as the belief in the rights of man about the time of the French Revolution. 6 Today, 50 years after this passage was written, more than 40 years after the Russian Revolution, and 30 years after the Great Depression, this belief has become a commonplace, and the transition from submission to objective economic laws which, though supposedly rational, were beyond man's control to belief in the capacity of man to control his economic destiny by conscious action seems to me to represent an advance in the application of reason to human affairs, an increased capacity in man to understand and master himself and his environment, which I should be prepared, if necessary, to call by the old-fashioned name of progress. I have no space to touch in detail on the similar processes at work in other fields. Even science, as we have seen, is now less concerned to investigate and establish objective laws of nature, than to frame working hypotheses by which man may be enabled to harness nature to his purposes and transform his environment. More significant, man has begun, through the conscious exercise of reason, not only to transform his environment but to transform himself. At the end of the 18th century, Malthus, in an epoch-making work, attempted to establish objective laws of population working, like Adam Smith's laws of the market, without anyone being conscious of the process. Today nobody believes in such objective laws, but the control of population has become a matter of rational and conscious social policy. We have seen in our time the lengthening by human effort of the span of human life and the altering of the balance between the generations in our population. We have heard of drugs consciously used to influence human behavior, and surgical operations designed to alter human character. Both man and society have changed, and have been changed by conscious human effort, before our eyes. But the most significant of these changes have probably been those brought about by the development and use of modern methods of persuasion and indoctrination. Educators at all levels are nowadays more and more consciously concerned to make their contribution to the shaping of society in a particular mold, and to inculcate in the rising generation the attitudes, loyalties and opinions appropriate to that type of society. Educational policy is an integral part of any rationally planned social policy. The primary function of reason, as applied to man in society, is no longer merely to investigate, but to transform, and this heightened consciousness of the power of man to improve the management of his social, economic and political affairs by the application of rational processes seems to me one of the major aspects of the 20th century revolution. This expansion of reason is merely part of the process which I called in an earlier lecture, individualization, the diversification of individual skills and occupations and opportunities which is the concomitant of an advancing civilization. Perhaps the most far-reaching social consequence of the Industrial Revolution has been the progressive increase in the numbers of those who learn to think, to use their reason. In Great Britain our passion for gradualism is such that the movement is sometimes scarcely perceptible. We have rested on the laurels of universal elementary education for the best part of a century, and have still not advanced very far or very quickly towards universal higher education. This did not matter so much when we led the world. It matters more when we are being overtaken by others in a greater hurry than ourselves, and when the pace has everywhere been speeded up by technological change. For the social revolution and the technological revolution and the scientific revolution are part and parcel of the same process. If you want an academic example of the process of individualization, consider the immense diversification over the past 50 or 60 years of history, or of science, or of any particular science, and the enormously increased variety of individual specializations which it offers. But I have a far more striking example of the process at a different level. More than 30 years ago, a high German military officer visiting the Soviet Union listened to some illuminating remarks from a Soviet officer concerned with the building up of the Red Air Force. We Russians have to do with still primitive human material. We are compelled to adapt the flying machine to the type of flyer who is at our disposal. To the extent to which we are successful in developing a new type of men, the technical development of the material will also be perfected. The two factors condition each other. Primitive men cannot be put into complicated machines. Point 7 Today, a bare generation later, we know that Russian machines are no longer primitive, and that millions of Russian men and women who plan, build and operate these machines are no longer primitive either. As a historian, I am more interested in this latter phenomenon. The rationalization of production means something far more important, the rationalization of man. All over the world today, primitive men are learning to use complicated machines, and in doing so are learning to think, to use their reason. The revolution, which you may justly call a social revolution, but which I will call in the present context the expansion of reason, is only just beginning. But it is advancing at a staggering pace to keep abreast of the staggering technological advances of the last generation. It seems abreast of the staggering technological advances of the last generation. It seems to me one of the major aspects of our 20th century revolution. Some of our pessimists and skeptics will certainly call me to order if I fail at this point to notice the dangers and the ambiguous aspects of the role assigned to reason in the contemporary world. In an earlier lecture, I pointed out that increasing individualization in the sense described did not imply any weakening of social pressures for conformity and uniformity. This is indeed one of the paradoxes of our complex modern society. Education, which is a necessary and powerful instrument in promoting the expansion of individual capacities and opportunities, and therefore of increasing individualization, is also a powerful instrument in the hands of interested groups for promoting social uniformity. Pleas frequently heard for more responsible broadcasting and television, or for a more responsible press, are directed in the first instance against certain negative phenomena which it is easy to condemn. But they quickly become pleas to use these powerful instruments of mass persuasion in order to inculcate desirable tastes and desirable opinions, the standard of desirability being found in the accepted tastes and opinions of the society. Such campaigns, in the hands of those who promote them, are conscious and rational processes designed to shape society, by shaping its individual members, in a desired direction. Other glaring examples of these dangers are provided by the commercial advertiser and the political propagandist. The two roles are, indeed, frequently doubled, openly in the United States, and rather more sheepishly in Great Britain. Parties and candidates employ professional advertisers to put themselves across. The two procedures, even when formally distinct, are remarkably similar. Professional advertisers and the heads of the propaganda departments of great political parties are highly intelligent men who bring all the resources of reason to bear on their task. Reason, however, as in the other instances we have examined, is employed not for mere exploration, but constructively, not statically, but dynamically. Professional advertisers and campaign managers are not primarily concerned with existing facts. They are interested in what the consumer or elector now believes or wants only in so far as this enters into the end product, i.e., what the consumer or elector can by skillful handling be induced to believe or want. Moreover, their study of mass psychology has shown them that the most rapid way to secure acceptance of their views is through an appeal to the irrational element in the makeup of the customer and elector, so that the picture which confronts us is one in which an elite of professional industrialists or party leaders, through rational processes more highly developed than ever before, attains its ends by understanding and trading on the irrationalism of the masses. The appeal is not primarily to reason, it proceeds in the main by the method which Oscar Wilde called, hitting below the intellect. I have somewhat overdrawn the picture lest I should be accused of underestimating the danger. Point 8, but it is broadly correct, and could easily be applied to other spheres. In every society, more or less coercive measures are applied by ruling groups to organize and control mass opinion. This method seems worse than some because it constitutes an abuse of reason. In reply to this serious and well-founded indictment, I have only two arguments. The first is the familiar one that every invention, every innovation, every new technique discovered in the course of history has had its negative as well as its positive sides. The cost has always to be borne by somebody. I do not know how long it was after the invention of printing before critics began to point out that it facilitated the spread of erroneous opinions. Today it is a commonplace to lament the death toll on the roads caused by the advent of the motor car, and even some scientists deplore their own discovery of ways and means to release atomic energy because of the catastrophic uses to which it can be, and has been, put. Such objections have not availed in the past, and seem unlikely to avail in the future, to stay the advance of new discoveries and inventions. What we have learned of the techniques and potentialities of mass propaganda cannot be simply obliterated. It is no more possible to return to the small-scale individualist democracy of Lockean or liberal theory, partially realized in Great Britain in the middle years of the 19th century, than it is possible to return to the horse and buggy or to early laissez-faire capitalism. But the true answer is that these evils also carry with them their own corrective. The remedy lies not in a cult of irrationalism or a renunciation of the extended role of reason in modern society, but in a growing consciousness from below as well as from above of the role which reason can play. This is not a utopian dream at a time when the increasing use of reason at all levels of society is being forced on us by our technological and scientific revolution. Like every other great advance in history, this advance has its costs and its losses, which have to be paid, and its dangers, which have to be faced. Yet, in spite of skeptics, and cynics, and prophets of disaster, especially among the intellectuals of countries whose former privileged position has been undermined, I shall not be ashamed to treat it as a signal example of progress in history. It is perhaps the most striking and revolutionary phenomenon of our time. The second aspect of the progressive revolution through which we are passing is the changed shape of the world. The great period of the 15th and 16th centuries, in which the medieval world finally broke up in ruins and the foundations of the modern world were laid, was marked by the discovery of new continents and by the passing of the world's center of gravity from the shores of the Mediterranean to those of the Atlantic. Even the lesser upheaval of the French Revolution had its geographical sequel in the calling in of the New World to redress the balance of the Old. But the changes wrought by the 20th century revolution are far more sweeping than anything that has happened since the 16th century. After some 400 years, the world's center of gravity has definitely shifted away from Western Europe. Western Europe, together with the outlying parts of the English-speaking world, has become an appanage of the North American continent, or, if you like, an agglomeration in which the United States serves both as powerhouse and as control tower. Nor is this the only, or perhaps the most significant, change. It is by no means clear that the world's center of gravity now resides, or will continue for long to reside, in the English-speaking world with its Western European annex. It appears to be the great land mass of Eastern Europe and Asia, with its extensions into Africa, which today calls the tune in world affairs. The unchanging East is nowadays a singularly worn-out cliché. Let us take a quick look at what has happened to Asia in the present century. The story begins with the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, the first admission of an Asiatic country to the charmed circle of European great powers. It may perhaps be regarded as a coincidence that Japan signalized her promotion by challenging and defeating Russia, and, in so doing, kindled the first spark which ignited the great 20th century revolution. The French revolutions of 1789 and 1848 had found their imitators in Europe. The first Russian Revolution of 1905 awakened no echo in Europe, but found its imitators in Asia. In the next few years, revolutions occurred in Persia, in Turkey, and in China. The First World War was not precisely a world war, but a European civil war, assuming that such an entity as Europe existed, with worldwide consequences. These included the stimulation of industrial development in many Asian countries, of anti-foreign feeling in China and of Indian nationalism, and the birth of Arab nationalism. The Russian Revolution of 1917 provided a further and decisive impulse. What was significant here was that its leaders looked persistently, but in vain, for imitators in Europe, and finally found them in Asia. It was Europe that had become unchanging, Asia that was on the move. I need not continue this familiar story down to the present time. The historian is hardly yet in a position to assess the scope and significance of the Asian and African Revolution. But the spread of modern technological and industrial processes, and of the beginnings of education and political consciousness, to millions of the population of Asia and Africa, is changing the face of those continents, and, while I cannot peer into the future, I do not know of any standard of judgment which would allow me to regard this as anything but a progressive development in the perspective of world history. The changed shape of the world resulting from these events has brought with it a relative decline in the weight, certainly of this country, perhaps of the English-speaking countries as a whole, in world affairs. But relative decline is not absolute decline, and what disturbs and alarms me is not the march of progress in Asia and Africa, but the tendency of dominant groups in this country, and perhaps elsewhere, to turn a blind or uncomprehending eye on these developments, to adopt towards them an attitude oscillating between mistrustful disdain and affable condescension, and to sink back into a paralyzing nostalgia for the past. What I have called the expansion of reason in our 20th century revolution has particular consequences for the historian, for the expansion of reason means, in essence, the emergence into history of groups and classes, of peoples and continents that hitherto lay outside it. In my first lecture I suggested that the tendency of mediaeval historians to view mediaeval society through the spectacles of religion was due to the exclusive character of their sources. I should like to pursue this explanation a little further. It has, I think, correctly, though no doubt with some exaggeration, been said that the Christian Church was the one rational institution of the Middle Ages. 9 being the one rational institution, it was the one historical institution, it alone was subject to a rational course of development which could be comprehended by the historian. Secular society was molded and organized by the Church, and had no rational life of its own. The mass of people belonged, like prehistoric peoples, to nature rather than to history. Modern history begins when more and more people emerge into social and political consciousness, become aware of their respective groups as historical entities having a past and a future, and enter fully into history. It is only within the last 200 years at most, even in a few advanced countries, that social, political and historical consciousness have begun to spread to anything like a majority of the population. It is only today that it has become possible for the first time even to imagine a whole world consisting of peoples who have in the fullest sense entered into history and become the concern, no longer of the colonial administrator or of the anthropologist, but of the historian. This is a revolution in our conception of history. In the 18th century history was still a history of elites. In the 19th century British historians began, haltingly and spasmodically, to advance towards a view of history as the history of the whole national community. Green, a rather pedestrian historian, won fame by writing the first history of the English people. In the 20th century every historian pays lip service to this view, and, though performance lags behind profession, I shall not dwell on these shortcomings, since I am much more concerned with our failure as historians to take account of the widening horizon of history outside this country and outside Western Europe. Acton in his report of 1896 spoke of universal history as that which is distinct from the combined history of all countries. He continued, it moves in a succession to which the nations are subsidiary. Their story will be told, not for their own sake, but in reference and subordination to a higher series, according to the time and degree in which they contribute to the common fortunes of mankind. 10 It went without saying for Acton that universal history, as he conceived it, was the concern of any serious historian. What are we at present doing to facilitate the approach to universal history in this sense? I did not intend in these lectures to touch on the study of history in this university, but it provides me with such striking examples of what I am trying to say that it would be cowardly of me to avoid grasping the nettle. In the past 40 years we have made a substantial place in our curriculum for the history of the United States. This is an important advance. But it has carried with it a certain risk of reinforcing the parochialism of English history, which already weighs like a dead hand on our curriculum, with a more insidious and equally dangerous parochialism of the English-speaking world. The history of the English-speaking world in the last 400 years has beyond question been a great period of history. But to treat it as the centerpiece of universal history, and everything else as peripheral to it, is an unhappy distortion of perspective. It is the duty of a university to correct such popular distortions. The School of Modern History in this university seems to me to fall short in the discharge of this duty. It is surely wrong that a candidate should be allowed to sit for an honors degree in history in a major university without an adequate knowledge of any modern language other than English. Let us take warning by what happened in Oxford to the ancient and respected discipline of philosophy when its practitioners came to the conclusion that they could get on very nicely with plain everyday English. It is surely wrong that no facilities should be offered to the candidate to study the modern history of any continental European country above the textbook level. A candidate possessing some knowledge of the affairs of Asia, Africa or Latin America has at present a very limited opportunity of displaying it in a paper called with magnificent 19th century panache, The Expansion of Europe. The title unfortunately fits the contents. The candidate is not invited to know anything even of countries with an important and well-documented history like China or Persia except what happened when the Europeans attempted to take them over. Lectures are, I am told, delivered in this university on the history of Russia and Persia and China, but not by members of the Faculty of History. The conviction expressed by the professor of Chinese in his inaugural lecture 5 years ago that China cannot be regarded as outside the mainstream of human history, 11 has fallen on deaf ears among Cambridge historians. What may well be regarded in the future as the greatest historical work produced in Cambridge during the past decade has been written entirely outside the history department, and without any assistance from it. I refer to Dr. Needham's Science and Civilization in China. This is a sobering thought. I should not have exposed these domestic sores to the public gaze but for the fact that I believe them to be typical of most other British universities and of British intellectuals in general in the middle years of the 20th century. That stale old quip about Victorian insularity, storms in the Channel, the continent isolated, has an uncomfortably topical ring today. Once more storms are raging in the world beyond, and, while we in the English-speaking countries huddle together and tell ourselves in plain everyday English that other countries and other continents are isolated by their extraordinary behavior from the boons and blessings of our civilization, it sometimes looks as if we, by our inability or unwillingness to understand, were isolating ourselves from what is really going on in the world. In the opening sentences of my first lecture I drew attention to the sharp difference of outlook which separates the middle years of the 20th century from the last years of the 19th. I should like in conclusion to develop this contrast, and, if in this context I use the words, liberal, and conservative, it will be readily understood that I am not using them in their sense as labels for British political parties. When Acton spoke of progress, he did not think in terms of the popular British concept of gradualism. The revolution, or as we say liberalism, is a striking phrase from a letter of 1887. The method of modern progress, he said in a lecture on modern history 10 years later, was revolution, and in another lecture he spoke of the advent of general ideas which we call revolution. This is explained in one of his unpublished manuscript notes. The Whig governed by compromise, the Liberal begins the reign of ideas. 12 Acton believed that the reign of ideas meant liberalism, and that liberalism meant revolution. In Acton's lifetime, liberalism had not yet spent its force as a dynamic of social change. In our day, what survives of liberalism has everywhere become a conservative factor in society. It would be meaningless today to preach a return to Acton. But the historian is concerned, first to establish where Acton stood, secondly to contrast his position with that of contemporary thinkers, and thirdly to inquire what elements in his position may be still valid today. The generation of Acton suffered, no doubt, from overweening self-confidence and optimism, and did not sufficiently realize the precarious nature of the structure on which its faith rested. But it possessed two things of both of which we are badly in need today: a sense of change as a progressive factor in history, and belief in reason as our guide for the understanding of its complexities. Let us now listen to some voices of the 1950s. I quoted in an earlier lecture Sir Louis Namier's expression of satisfaction that, while practical solutions were sought for, concrete problems, programs and ideals are forgotten by both parties, and his description of this is a symptom of national maturity. Point 13. I am not fond of these analogies between the lifespan of individuals and that of nations, and, if such an analogy is invoked, it tempts one to ask what follows when we have passed the stage of maturity. But what interests me is the sharp contrast drawn between the practical and the concrete, which are praised, and programs and ideals, which are condemned. This exaltation of practical action over idealistic theorizing is, of course, the hallmark of conservatism. In Namier's thought, it represents the voice of the 18th century, of England at the accession of George III, protesting against the impending onset of Acton's revolution and reign of ideas. But the same familiar expression of out-and-out conservatism in the form of out-and-out empiricism is highly popular in our day. It may be found in its most popular form in Professor Trevor Roper's remark that, when radicals scream that victory is indubitably theirs, sensible conservatives knock them on the nose. Point 14. Professor Oakeshott offers us a more sophisticated version of this fashionable empiricism. In Our Political Concerns, he tells us, we sail a boundless and bottomless sea, where there is neither starting point nor appointed destination, and where our sole aim can be to keep afloat on an even keel. Point 15. I need not pursue the catalogue of recent writers who have denounced political utopianism and messianism. These have become the current terms of opprobrium for far-reaching radical ideas on the future of society. Nor shall I attempt to discuss recent trends in the United States, where historians and political theorists have had less inhibitions than their colleagues in this country in openly proclaiming their allegiance to conservatism. I will quote only a remark by one of the most distinguished and most moderate of American conservative historians, Professor Samuel Morrison of Harvard, who in his presidential address to the American Historical Association in December 1950 thought that the time had come for a reaction against what he called the Jefferson-Jackson F. Roosevelt line, and pleaded for a history of the United States, written from a sanely conservative point of view. Point 16. But it is Professor Popper who, at any rate in Great Britain, has once more expressed this cautious conservative outlook in its clearest and most uncompromising form. Echoing Namier's rejection of programs and ideals, he attacks policies which allegedly aim at remodeling the whole of society, in accordance with a definite plan, commends what he calls piecemeal social engineering, and does not apparently shrink from the imputation of piecemeal tinkering and muddling through. Point 17. On one point, indeed, I should pay tribute to Professor Popper. He remains a stout defender of reason, and will have no truck with past or present excursions into irrationalism. But, if we look into his prescription of piecemeal social engineering, we shall see how limited is the role which he assigns to reason. Though his definition of piecemeal engineering is not very precise, we are specifically told that criticism of ends is excluded, and the cautious examples which he gives of its legitimate activities, constitutional reform, and a tendency towards a greater equalization of incomes show plainly that it is intended to operate within the assumptions of our existing society. Point 18. The status of reason in Professor Popper's scheme of things is, in fact, rather like that of a British civil servant, qualified to administer the policies of the government in power and even to suggest practical improvements to make them work better, but not to question their fundamental presuppositions or ultimate purposes. This is useful work. I, too, have been a civil servant in my day. But this subordination of reason to the assumptions of the existing order seems to me in the long run wholly unacceptable. This is not how Acton thought of reason when he propounded his equation: revolution equals liberalism equals the reign of ideas. Progress in human affairs, whether in science or in history or in society, has come mainly through the bold readiness of human beings not to confine themselves to seeking piecemeal improvements in the way things are done, but to present fundamental challenges in the name of reason to the current way of doing things and to the avowed or hidden assumptions on which it rests. I look forward to a time when the historians and sociologists and political thinkers of the English-speaking world will regain their courage for the task. It is, however, not the waning of faith in reason among the intellectuals and the political thinkers of the English-speaking world which perturbs me most, but the loss of the pervading sense of a world in perpetual motion. This seems at first sight paradoxical, for rarely has so much superficial talk been heard of changes going on around us. But the significant thing is that change is no longer thought of as achievement, as opportunity, as progress, but as an object of fear. When our political and economic pundits prescribe, they have nothing to offer us but the warning to mistrust radical and far-reaching ideas, to shun anything that savors of revolution, and to advance, if advance we must, as slowly and cautiously as we can. At a moment when the world is changing its shape more rapidly and more radically than at any time in the last 400 years, this seems to me a singular blindness, which gives ground for apprehension, not that the me a singular blindness, which gives ground for apprehension, not that the worldwide movement will be stayed, but that this country, and perhaps other English-speaking countries, may lag behind the general advance, and relapse helplessly and uncomplainingly into some nostalgic backwater. For myself I remain an optimist, and when Sir Lewis Namier warns me to eschew programs and ideals, and Professor Oakeshott tells me that we are going nowhere in particular and that all that matters is to see that nobody rocks the boat, and Professor Popper wants to keep the dear old T-model on the road by dint of a little piecemeal engineering, and Professor Trevor Roper knocks screaming radicals on the nose, and Professor Morrison pleads for history written in a sane conservative spirit, I shall look out on a world in tumult and a world in travail, and shall answer in the well-worn words of a great scientist, and yet, it moves. Notes Introduction I am grateful to the University of Birmingham for granting me access to the Carr papers in the Special Collections section of the University Library. I would like to thank Jonathan Haslam for his careful reading of a draft of this introduction and his helpful suggestions. All views are my own. Carr, An Autobiography, 1980, in Michael Cox ed. E.